Welcome. This is another in a series of Interpreter Foundation broadcasts. These are our Scripture Roundtables. Tonight's roundtable is Old Testament Lesson 32, the Book of Job. The exact title is I Know That My Redeemer Liveth. Tonight, our participants in this roundtable are Cassandra Hedelius, who is with us from the East Coast. We have John Gee, who is with us. A new participant tonight is Richard William, who is welcome, and we're excited to have him on our panel tonight. My name's Martin Tanner. I'll be moderating. As we start off tonight, I have a real short story that I would like to share. I remember being a little kid and being in Sunday school, and our instructor said that we were going to now study the book of Job. And I remember being a little bit in wonderment, I guess is the right way to say it, because I really didn't know much about Job. And then the next week he wanted to talk more about Job. And the next week we spent an entire month on the book of Job when I was in grade school, and I thought to myself, if our instructor, thought so much of this book that he wanted to spend an entire month on it, there must be something there. And this has come to be one of my favorite books in the entire Bible. It happens to be one of the oldest books of the Bible, according to many Talmudic sources. It is another book, in addition to the Pentateuch, that was actually written by Moses himself. Whether that's true or not, of course, we don't know. But the reason for that belief is the history and ideas of the Jews, but also the language and content of the book. These are very, very ancient. As we get closer to the present in the Bible, we find fewer and fewer of the ancient ideas of God, less of the ideas that God is human-like and really close. In the book of Job, do we not only find that characteristic about God, because in the beginning he has this quite interesting dialogue with Satan, but we also find the idea of a divine counsel. And the divine counsel motif is something that Joseph Smith very strongly believed in. If you go to volume 6 of the History of the Church, starting on page 307, Joseph Smith describes God and the council of the gods, where they got together and decided about the creation of the earth and many other concepts. And we see a similar kind of a council in the beginning of the book of Job, where it discusses the idea of who is this guy Job. And the other fascinating part of it is that Satan appears on the scene, and he has a discussion with Yahweh, with Jehovah, and they first decide that Satan can do anything that he wants to Job's property, and that if that were to happen, the assertion is from the devil that Job will fail, that he will curse God. But Job passes the test. And then there's another description of the divine counsel. And in this second divine counsel, you have a similar idea, except that it goes even further. The devil can do anything that he wants to Job except take his life. And so he winds up with all kinds of afflictions. And from this background, we have the idea that is so difficult to deal with at all times in history, when we see suffering of people who are innocent. And we all wonder, what is the purpose of suffering? Why do people who are innocent and who have done no wrong, young children, and many, many others who are so righteous, who suffer very difficult afflictions. That is the story and the message of Job. And of course there are several others, but that's one of the central themes of the book of Job. The book of Job dates to approximately 600 BC in the current form that we have it. It may be much earlier. Another interesting sidelight.
I'm not sure that we know when it dates to.
Fair enough.
I've read a number of our arguments on this, and I just don't. I think we're guessing, and so some people's guesses are early, some people's guesses are late, but I think we just don't know.
Go ahead.
Well, some of the language in there is unusual, and that makes it really hard to date because, and the Masoretes had a lot of problems figuring out what to do with it. There are a number of places in the Bible where they said, well, this is what's written, we think it ought to be something else. And there are a lot of those in Job. It's from a language perspective, it's a problem. There's no references to anything that the historical references. We have the Kasdim and we have the Sabaeans, but those don't really help that much because they cover a wide range. So there's just not much to date it with. So that's my 2 cents on that.
And a great 2 cents they are. There's a lot of other unique features about the book of Job, I'm sure. John, you'll have some more to say about that because there are some Egyptian influences on it, apparently.
Yes.
And we also have this really unusual book that fits in the Jewish Old Testament that is about some guy who's not from the Judeo traditions. I mean, Job, according to the setting, is from Uz, and there are references to where that might be, but it's southeast of Israel. And the early rabbis had written in a number of different places about how Job was this really good Gentile person. And then after Jesus came on the scene, and there were some references to Christ that the Christians perceived in the book of Job, then all of a sudden they thought that Job was this horrible, evil guy who had managed, along with the help of the devil, to get his book in the ancient Jewish scriptures, which is kind of an interesting twist. A book about a Gentile, an entire book in the Old Testament. That's a really
that's also good.
That's true. You're absolutely right. Richard, you had some great comments in your notes about references to Job in a number of different scriptures and sources.
Yeah, so Job is a fun book for, I think, Christianity just because it's so popular and it's referenced in multiple cases. It's referenced in the Old Testament, and which can be kind of fun back to the dating idea. I mean, we know it can't be older than certain dates, but we don't know how much past that it might be based on references of historical cities and geographical locations. But Ezekiel references Job, so it must be older than Ezekiel is the idea. Then you also have some references in Corinthians and the New Testament, and also in Doctrine and Covenants. And the idea behind it is that Job was such a powerful figure that people look back to Job to understand the messages that he shared. And as Latter-day Saints, we like to use the book of Job, I think probably because of all the suffering that we have felt in the latter days with the crossing of the plains, and we probably still feel persecuted. And the book of Job is a really good opportunity for us to look at, well, how does a righteous person suffer when they've lost everything? So I want to go over a couple of those references that are interesting, and Paul quotes Job in Corinthians 3:19 in reference to Job 5:13. So Corinthians reads, "For the wisdom of this world is foolish with God, for it is written, He taketh the wise in their own craftiness." And Job 5:13 says, "He taketh the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the forward is carried headlong." So you have a few of these references. There's more references that are similar to that, the same as the one as in Ezekiel mentions his name. But then you also, I think it becomes really important to Latter-day Saints because Job is mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants when in that moment with Joseph Smith when Christ says to Joseph Smith, "Thou art not yet as Job," as he's suffering in prison, and he doesn't think he can bear any more. And he says that you have not suffered as much as my servant Job has suffered. So it's fun for the Latter-day Saints, and if it's okay, I thought I'd take just a moment of just kind of going over a little bit of, the idea between Job and Latter-day Saints. Or do you want me to wait for that for later?
No, go right ahead. That'd be great.
Okay, so and that fits really well with kind of like where Job fits and what Latter-day Saints understand about Job. But one of the only problems that we run into is that Latter-day Saints generally read the first couple of chapters and we go, oh, poetry, right? And we go poetry after poetry after poetry, and we have a lot of chapters of poetry in Job. And then we get to the very last chapter, and if we survived, we get to the last chapter and we get a lot of good messages about how Job was able to overcome. But most Latter-day Saints don't ever really grasp the middle. And the middle is really how Job overcomes and what the process that he does to overcome his suffering, what he does to suffer righteously. And what we're kind of left with if we don't focus on those chapters in the middle, or if we don't at least glean something from those chapters in the middle, is we're left it up to ourselves to try to determine, well, what can we do to suffer righteously? We know that Job did make the right choice, as it says in the last chapter, but how did he do that? Well, we don't really know if we didn't read the big block of poetry in the middle. So it's something for Latter-day Saints to really try to focus on some of the poetry in the middle and not just take the bookends of the book.
Well stated. If someone is interested in taking a look at Job actually written in a poetic style, there are several really good new translations of the Hebrew Bible that have chapters 3 through the end that are in the poetic style, so you can actually read them not through the absolute end, but through the beginning of chapter 42, which kind of show all the poetry that Richard's been talking about. And it's an amazingly well crafted book, an incredibly well thought through book. It's really a literary masterpiece. The book of Job is absolutely spectacular in the way it's been written and crafted.
And Martin, I want to say one more thing real quick, if that's okay, and then I'll be quiet so everyone else can talk.
Oh, never do that. That way the roundtables are too short. You always jump in when you have anything to say.
I think it's important before we really get into the big discussion of the lesson to understand really how Job fits. The rabbis like to try to block groups of text together, and you could also, if you look at any sort of official criticism, you can look at canonical criticism and see how it kind of fits into the whole scheme of things with the book of Job. And there's 5 books of poetry in the Old Testament. And if you look at it in a spiritual sense, what people have done, if they've determined, we have the Psalms, or not, probably, hopefully not too overarching of a theme, but is kind of considered of the Psalms or how to pray. Proverbs are how we act. Ecclesiastes are how to enjoy. Job is how to suffer. And then even they group the Song of Solomon, even though not a lot of people enjoy reading the Song of Solomon, or maybe they do enjoy, I don't know. But that's how to love. And it's kind of considered one of the 5 books on how a spiritual leader connects to 5 different spiritual senses, so that he knows how to suffer, how to pray, how to act, how to enjoy, and how to love. And Job is part of that. So I think that on the spiritual sense, I mean, the Old Testament has a lot, well, on the non-spiritual sense, the Old Testament has a lot of laws, and I mean, you got the big book of Leviticus, you have a number of scriptures, a number of books based on just the laws of the Old Testament, the laws of how to live. And then you have these 5 books on how to spiritually live. And I think that gives some weight to the book of Job, where we should probably take it more seriously, or try harder to understand some of that poetry.
That's really well said. It is, of those 5 books of poetry, probably it probably dives into the most difficult question of them all. You talked about suffering, and you don't talk to too many people who say, "Oh gosh, loving." Yeah, that's a hard thing for me to understand. At certain points in your life, maybe, but suffering, especially suffering of the righteous and the innocent, that's a difficult one. At this point, Cassandra, you had some great comments about the idea and the meaning of being righteous, and how we should. You had some great comments. I won't even preface it. You just have this great story about people in your life's experience, which is kind of bringing us back to earth here.
Okay. Yes, this did remind me of my experience, and hopefully I'm not the only one who had to learn this lesson. It's an important enough lesson that even if it is obvious to everyone but me, I think it's worth repeating. And so the book Job starts out being very, very detailed about how awesome Job was. He was so righteous, he was so charitable, he helped widows, and was just this model of righteous Christian living. We are left with no doubt whatsoever. Job was a good dude. And that's, obviously part of the entire structural theme of this book, that this very, very good dude could have these things done to him, and it makes the test more visceral in a way, more of a test, perhaps, that if things are taken away from you, it's almost worse than just having things happen to you. And so my own experience, what I needed to learn was this very basic and obvious lesson that being righteous doesn't mean being free from trials. And yeah, that's obvious. But so I grew up in an area, I was a Mormon from my childhood. My ward had both an area that was very wealthy, many NFL players had homes there, and then also several ward members, so very, very large, gorgeous houses. And then also the ward had homes that were more modest, including my own. And so growing up that way, a lot of those people who lived in the nicer, wealthier area were just fantastic people. I still admire them immensely. A lot of them were called to be my bishops and my stake presidents and leaders in the ward, and they served, and they were leaders, and they were so kind and charitable, and I just got this link in my head somehow, just how in childhood you construct meaning out of things, that if you are righteous, as they obviously were because they were leaders in the church, then you don't have any problems. to live in a big house and have lots of money and a great family and a wonderful life, and nothing ever goes wrong. So in my childish head, being righteous means no problems. And it took quite a while until young adulthood, and really just a function of more life experience, more maturity. I moved to an area. Another good lesson was I learned that my family's house that I had thought was very modest compared to the mansion actually was itself a mansion compared to some other houses that I was very graciously entertained in some other areas that I lived. It's all a matter of perspective there. But just as I got to know more people, I served in more capacities and was very privileged to be guided in by some very wonderful people. I realized that some of the best people I have ever known and ever expect to know are the ones who have had the most terrible problems. And being righteous means sometimes a life full of turmoil and deep sorrow, deep trials. I think it hit home the most when I was able to serve in the temple and get to know a lot of my fellow temple workers. And very gracious, so many of them had been through divorces, had children who had major problems. Some of them were now facing raising their grandchildren at a stage of life that they didn't expect to be doing that. So many of these very, very difficult problems, and yet they were the most exceptional, extraordinary people that I have ever met. They were angels. They are. And so when I read Job, I see my own childhood rebuked, my naive assumptions rebuked, and that we choose righteousness because the rewards are much, much deeper than a nice house and an easy life. And if that's all that we were going to get out of it, it wouldn't be worth it. The rewards of choosing to follow the Savior, to keep the commandments, are a growth and an ability to reach potential and closeness with our Father in heaven that we could never get any other way, and that is worth it.
That absolutely is worth it. Well, thank you so much. That was a great story, and one that I think will strike home with a lot of people. My mother made a comment to me once when I was commenting about how difficult I thought life was for me, but it wasn't for anyone else. And she said, well, you know, there are two kinds of people in life. There are people who have really huge problems and trials and difficulties, and then there are the other people who you don't know very well yet. But if you knew them, you would know they had all of those things as well. And
I've never met anyone that I would want to trade places with. Not even one.
I can think of maybe one or two. I'm kidding. But no, you're right though. Everyone has their trials and their difficulties, and we all. I heard a near-death experience from someone who shall remain nameless, but who had tried to commit suicide, and was told that they had to come back, and the reason that they had to come back was because their life's purpose was not yet finished. And the other point that was most relevant here in the context of Job was that this person was told that to wish for someone else's life, or to exit life, as in with suicide, or to cut it short, is a slap in the face to God because you are giving away or saying that you find no value in the life that you chose and that you have organized and helped schedule and arrange, and you are giving up on that wonderful gift. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective and a unique way to look at it, one which Job himself had. We can jump into the text here. Are there any other comments about the background or other comments before we jump into the storyline of Job itself? Okay. One of the things that I'm going to request, if anybody wants to jump in here in a bit, is for comments on the idea of why does God allow the innocent to suffer, which is one of the central features of Job. So think about that a little bit. I have some ideas. I would enjoy hearing your own. But we know that really is true of Job, that he was an innocent sufferer, because right in verse 1, we come straight out of the chute with this statement that he was a good man and he was careful to do nothing that was evil. And his friends come after all these horrible things happen to him. His family is killed, all his possessions are destroyed, and then after the second dialogue and discussion between, challenge if you will, between Satan and Jehovah, we have this second test where Job is smitten with diseases, and he has these sores that break out all over his body. We read in chapter 2, starting in about verse 9, or excuse me, about verse 7. And Job complains, and he's sad, and he has a really difficult time with all of this, as anyone would. And it's at that point that we, as we carefully consider this book, wonder why it is that these things come to Job, except that we are told that this is a wager or a contest. It's really not I'm in trouble now. It's not a good idea to talk about God wagering with the devil. I take it all back. This is a contest that was approved by God and the devil. And it's from the very first pages there that we gain some insights into what is the purpose of all this suffering. And Cassandra kind of hit the nail on the head as she described all this. It's not about who is worthy or what is fair. You know, as my kids say, Dad, that really isn't fair, to which I usually respond something like, life is not about fairness. The more you live, the more you will understand. Life has nothing to do with fairness. Life has to do with all kinds of other things. And the dialogue between Satan and Jehovah also has nothing to do with fairness. It has to do with the idea of being loyal to God, the idea of being moral and righteous in the face of anything that comes your way, and the idea that Cassandra will talk about in a while, the idea summed up in one word of integrity. Will you have integrity no matter what happens to you? Will you be faithful to God no matter what comes your way, whether it's fair or not, whether it's easy to face or the very most difficult thing that could possibly be? And Job is about that whole discussion.
Can I jump in maybe?
Please do, please do.
Okay. One of the things I want to look at here, and this deals with the things you're talking about, it comes out of this dialogue, and it shows up first. It shows up in both the first and second chapter in this dialogue between the Lord and Satan. And it shows up in Job 1:8. And the King James has it, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? That there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil." Well, that's not a bad translation, but I think it can actually be done better. So the word here, "considered," is actually an idiom in Hebrew, and it's to sim lave, which is to set the heart or the mind on something, and it means to pay attention or to consider carefully. But here it's used a little bit differently, because normally you pay attention to something. And here they're actually using the preposition all, which is to pay attention against. So I'm going to retranslate it here. "And the Lord said unto Satan, Have you set your heart against my servant Job? Because there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and avoids evil." And so right here at the beginning, they've already set up that because Job is righteous, Satan has it in for him. And it's there in the opening statements there that the Lord makes to Satan. He's already considered Job, and he's got him in his sights, and he's going to really test him.
That's great. I like that translation a lot. Thank you. I've never considered it quite that way at all.
Just a moment. That reminds me of a story. I don't recall where I heard it, but a man is traveling, proverb, folklore kind of a story, and he's allowed to see the unseen beings that are influencing the people in this area, and he sees the city that only has one devil hovering over it, and he says, "Oh, that city must be so righteous. They only have one devil to influence them." And an angel tells him, "No, they are so wicked that they only need one devil to keep them going." And then he sees another city that is just surrounded by devils everywhere, and oh, they must be so wicked. Look at all those devils influencing them. And nope, they are very righteous, and all of those devils can't get them to turn away, but they keep trying.
That's a great story. Thank you. One of the things that I have always found fascinating about the book of Job is that he's not a guy who just never complains. Chapter 3 is about Job's complaints to God. He's wondering out loud why all these things had happened to him. And he states in here at different places in his sorrow and his sadness that he wishes that he hadn't been born, and that he has no peace, he complains. He has troubles. And so the fascinating thing to me about Job is that we are not expected to suffer in complete silence or to not complain when we have difficulties, but there should be a purpose in those statements or in those complaints, if you will, and that is to try to understand. And that, as we go through the book of Job, is what we glean from these different discussions that he has with his three friends, or three not so good friends, depending on your point of view and where you happen to be reading. You have this beautiful, if you take time to read it, dialogue between Job and his friends, where they discuss such things as fairness, why these things happen, faithfulness to God, and a number of other different wonderful things that really impact us all whenever we have difficulties in our life here. Any other specific comments? I know, Richard, you had some notes about the way Job is broken down. Anything you'd like to toss in here at this point?
My comments, well, there was in chapter 18 and 19, it's just one of the dialogue that happened, and maybe I'll take about 30 seconds to just review that real quick. And just
Sure.
some text. Sorry, what was that?
Please do.
Okay. That I found interesting because, I mean, like you were saying, Martin, is that it's a beautiful dialogue back and forth between him and his friends, and 18 starts out just like the rest in the King James Version. It says, "Then answered Bildad the Shuhite," he said, and he goes through this long process of explaining why Job must have been the reason for all these bad things that's happening. He gives examples. He says, "Well, look at robbers. Robbers have bad lives, you know, oversimplifying things, and look at all these other bad people in this world, and guess what? They have horrible situations. They lose all of their belongings. They lose their friends, just like you did. What did you do?" Trying to hint at the idea that, Job, you must have done something to cause this to happen to you. And this is my favorite interaction between him and his friends, just as a result of, he goes through that and he addresses it. So anyone that's really interested in almost like a debate type of a scenario or an ethics class can have fun with this. But he responds in 19, and this is probably one of the more famous verses out of it. After a long discussion, he says, "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the later day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet to my flesh I shall see God." He says a few more things that are pretty powerful as well, but once again you have an example of Job going through this dialogue back and forth between his friends, and them trying to point out why all these things must have happened to him, why bad things happen to people. It must be because they're bad. Well, Job responds in every way throughout every single section of his dialogues. Whatever you say, you can say what you want. I know my God lives. I know that my Redeemer liveth.
It's a beautiful statement. One of the newer translations of chapter 19 has what I find to be a wonderful translation, because it sort of captures the essence that you don't always come away with if you read chapter 19, verse 25. It says, "But I know there is someone in heaven who will come to my defense," saying this great Christian idea that Jesus is our advocate in heaven. He knows everything about us. He knows all the good things and all the really horrible things that we could ever think of about ourselves or know about ourselves, and he will be our advocate as long as we are true to him. It's a beautiful statement there. It's, as Richard said, one of the most spectacular moments in the entire book of Job. Other comments about the book of Job that people want to bring up? Maybe before
can I add a little comment on that scripture we just hit, 1925?
Yes, let's do.
Yeah, the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation that was available, it was translated about 3 centuries before Christ, 2 to 3 centuries. It has a little bit different take on this passage, but it says that I know that the one who will set me free will be upon the earth to resurrect my flesh. And this is from the Lord, and he will do these things for me. Very different reading there, but it feeds into the Christian notion. of that passage.
It does. Great comment. And you know, somebody who is an astute reader of the scriptures will say, well, which one of you two is reading a really bad scholar who does horrible translations, because they're so very different? And the answer is that if you take a look at many verses in the book of Job, they will have something like the footnote in the one that I'm reading from in verse 26 of chapter 19 that says, verse 26 in Hebrew is unclear. The exact meaning is unknown. Several different translations are possible. And that's because some of the book of Job is just really difficult to decipher. So scholars come up with different readings and different meanings for it.
Well, it's actually not. I don't think it's that bad of a translation.
Yeah, see, there's
not
John,
the only one
he and
that's
like two. I was going to say, John, you and two other people in the world can read this crystal clear.
Oh, I don't know about that, but it's not that difficult, and it's. If people ask me, I always tell them that the King James is no worse than any other translation. In some cases, a good deal better.
Other thoughts on chapter 19? We should definitely, before the time escapes us, Cassandra, have you talk about Job chapter 27, because it deals with this wonderful theme of integrity, which is so central to Job.
Sure, and before I go to that, I will add a thought on chapter 19 that we were talking about. Just when John was reading off that alternate rendering, that the Lord speaks for us, He advocates for us. I just kept thinking of the hymn, "Be still my soul, the Lord is on thy side." Sometimes when life is really hard, and especially when it's partly our own fault, we feel that maybe He is mad at us or distant, or just we're separated somehow, but that's never true. He's on our side, and probably more especially when we are suffering. And so then jumping ahead to chapter 27, I will go ahead and pull this up here and read it. I think I'm one of those who Richard was talking about, who kind of glosses over the poetry and skips to the more straightforward stuff at the end. So here's the straightforward stuff at the end. Not that I don't love poetry, but yes, straightforward. Great. So chapter 27, starting in verse 2, says, "As God liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty who hath vexed my soul, all the while my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. My lips shall not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. God forbid that I should justify you. Till I die, I will not remove mine integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast, and will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me so long as I live." And this concept of integrity, and I won't remove it from me. When I hear integrity, I usually hear a modern sense of it than it means don't cheat on a test or steal candy and keep your word, that kind of thing. Integrity. But I think that this is referring to it more in the sense of fidelity, loyalty, strength in your commitment. And especially when you think of the Old Testament, I think it's useful to think of the Old Testament as basically one big metaphor about Savior as the bridegroom and Israel as the bride, and Israel meaning you, whoever you are listening right now, a marriage. And a marriage is meant to be a very close, intimate relationship that doesn't work that loses its character as a marriage unless both partners have total and complete fidelity to each other, total and complete integrity within that covenant. And because that's really the main identity. A covenant, a marriage, a relationship, a affinity between you and the Savior that is so strong that, to call it a marriage is really kind of startling, but what is offered to us and what the Savior wants for us is to have that relationship that is so close and so strong that that metaphor does start to make sense. And so when Job says that he will not remove his integrity from him, I read that in light of the idea of the covenant, that I would never compromise my integrity, my commitment to this covenant, my identity, which I have chosen as a covenant member of Israel, as someone who has made my commitment to the Lord, said that I am allied with Him, and I will be loyal to Him no matter what, no matter how difficult it gets. And so earlier when we got to the point of Job was asking questions and saying, things like, God, this is really hard. Why did it have to be this way? And I'm obviously glossing over and simplifying a lot. But just the point was made that it's okay to question and to ask why. But a hot topic right now and on many saints is this idea that, well, I have questions, I need answers, I have all of these questions, and it gets into doubts about the church, about whatever the topic of the day. And questioning is fine, but the integrity part comes into it, that your questioning has to be from a place of fidelity, loyalty, commitment to that covenant. As long as that is your foundation and that is what colors your attitude and your searching and your pondering and your who you choose to reach out to, what sources you choose to pursue, then it'll be fine. Questioning is great. We should all be seeking truth. We don't have to be afraid of questions, and we definitely don't have to be afraid of answers because they are available. But what we all have to be absolutely certain of is that in that covenant, our integrity is completely absolute, unshakable. That even if we have to endure things on the scale that Job endured, we still will never give up our fidelity and our loyalty to the Lord.
I think along with that, Cassandra, the Hebrew word that's translated as integrity in that passage does mean faithfulness, fidelity, loyalty. All of that is already in the Hebrew, so you're not really stretching anything to come up with that interpretation. Nicely done.
Nicely done.
Yeah, I totally knew that as scholarliness. That's me.
There are 4 people that can read this without question now on the entire planet. Okay. Before the time escapes us here, John, would you mind commenting about chapter 31 and its Egyptian connection here with the negative covenant language that it has through here? I've heard that described as being similar to the Book of the Dead with all of its negative covenants before.
Which I did do my dissertation on.
There you go. See?
Yeah, there's some similarities there. And it's not couched in the same kind of language as the native confession, which is either an I did not or I will not do something. It's like this is a list of if I had done this and if I had done that. So it's not, it's adapted if anything. And although a lot of the sentiments are similar, in general and specific, a lot of the things that the Egyptians were concerned with don't always play out. So if there's any sort of borrowing here, it's more on the conceptual level, as far as I can tell. But that doesn't mean that there is or isn't influence. It's just it's not strictly borrowed. A lot of the ideals that the Egyptians had, they have. So let's just take 31:17. Have I eaten my morsel myself alone, and the fatherless hath not eaten thereof? In the Egyptians, they're often saying, I gave bread to the hungry, clothing to the naked, I provided a boat to him who didn't have one. He's got two sides of the banks and it's built along the river. If you don't have a boat, there's no way you're getting across, unless you want to go swim with crocodiles or get bilharziases from the water. So, you know, there a lot of the similarities there, but then they come on such a general level that it's hard to say that you don't find those in other places as well. You know, there are some places where there are clear influence from various cultures. There's a much closer one in chapter 38, whereas there's a direct to Egyptian material there, at least in the Hebrew. But it's not a slavish borrowing by any means.
Tell us about 38.
You really sure you want to get into this?
Well, you can give us the 2-minute version. I don't know.
No, it's
that were possible from
38:36. 38:36, which in the King James it says, "Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts?" And that's where maybe King James is a little less close translation. But in the Hebrew, in some places it's translated, "Who hath given wisdom to the ibis?" But the word that's actually there is "Who hath placed wisdom in Thoth," who is an Egyptian god. So there's clear reference to Egyptian deities in here. It speaks to a little more international milieu. You know, we are told that Job is a Gentile, but this is actually God speaking. And so I'm not really sure. I haven't sorted out for myself what to do with that. I don't think you ought to bring it up in Gospel Doctrine. But there is some clear Egyptian influence there, and so I don't know why there couldn't be some in the earlier chapter. You know, I think it speaks to you know, we see a lot of times where God speaks to us out of our culture. For instance, when God calls Paul, he quotes a line from Euripides, one of the plays, in which, if you look in the context, and I'm not going to, must have hit Paul like a ton of bricks. But we don't normally think of God quoting Euripides. He speaks to us after our manner of language that we can come to an understanding. And he does that here.
He does that here. Well said. That's a great comment. We have just a few minutes left. Any parting thoughts about the book of Job from anyone who would like to join in here?
I'd like to give one last little morsel from the text on just what I had prepared from the last chapter in 42:15. Just the after Job overcomes all of the suffering and is blessed, he was given, more than he had lost with his land and cattle and everything, and then he is blessed with 7 sons and 3 daughters. And I always found it really interesting that after he's blessed with 7 sons and 3 daughters, the text names the 3 daughters, but it doesn't name the 7 sons, and that seems a little abnormal for the Old Testament text is always very masculine, is the way it sides. And so I did a little bit of research on just the names, and I think that this can be fun for some people. So I just wanted to talk for just a moment about one of the names. So the 3 are Jemima and Kaziah, and then Karen Hapuk. And those are pronounced in not good Hebrew, so I apologize. But Karen Hapuk is one of the most interesting to me. Karen is the Hebrew for horn, Karen in Hebrew, and Hapuk is a little bit of a difficult word to translate. It's not used very often in the Old Testament, but it's commonly translated as paint or and those kind of ideas of some sort of a coloring. One translation is the actual stone antimony, which is interesting because antimony was, if you look at some of the history, was a stone that just it shines a lot. It has a lot of glittering about it, and it was actually common practice back in the old world to crush it up and sprinkle it over your eyelashes for women, so that women's eyelashes would sparkle. It was considered to be one of the very first forms of female makeup. And if you look it up if you do some Google searching for antimony, it's commonly blue. And I found that interesting for the fact that Job, where it's described, he's dead in the heart of the Hebrew land, and there's probably not a lot of blue-eyed people back then or in that area, and he has this daughter that's born after all of his suffering, and he names her his name that suggests a blue-eyed girl is what I'd like to call it. And it's kind of fun to see some of the pictures that you see from the Middle East of the abnormality of a blue-eyed girl or person from the Middle East. And this little girl, Karen Hapuk, is the horn of antimony, is what I call her, or just the epitome of beautiful. It's probably another way to put it. Just the strength of beauty, and the names are fun in the Old Testament because they generally, the way they're pronounced is the way that they're written in Hebrew a lot of times, and you can learn a lot about what the people are. I mean, there's a lot written about about names and how significant they are and how they're written. But I thought that was interesting.
Perfect. Other comments? Other thoughts?
I'll talk about the numbers.
Okay.
If you carefully compare the numbers from chapter 1 and chapter 42 of Job, you notice that for all his camels, oxen, sheep, so forth, the numbers in 42 are doubled.
Mm-hmm.
But for the sons and daughters, they're the same.
Mm-hmm.
But if you consider the eternal nature of the family, he has 7 sons, 3 daughters before, another 7 sons, 3 daughters after, so he doubles those as well.
Great comment. Great comment. one parting thought from me, and then we'll wrap it up, and that is that in chapter 42, we have in verse 5 this idea that in the past, Job is saying he knew God only through what others had told him. He says, I've known God through what others have told me, but now I have seen you with mine own eyes. That may be because God has appeared to him, but it may also be, and even if God appeared to him, it would certainly also be because at times of suffering, and this gets to the point of the book of Job, what is the purpose of suffering? Job and all of us, through our suffering, have the opportunity to draw closer to God. It seems to be a sad part of human nature, but a very useful one, that in times of difficulty and trial and suffering, we lean on God because we're faced with circumstances beyond our abilities. And by leaning on God and being forced to draw closer to Him than perhaps we normally are, we strengthen our relationship with Him. And so here in verse 5 of chapter 42, we have this jewel about what the purpose of suffering in life is. It's to become closer to God, to draw nigh unto Him, and to try to understand Him and be patient as we do it. Any other parting thoughts? Okay, let's wrap it up there. We'll thank everyone who has...
I was just going to say...
Go ahead. Please.
Oh, sorry, Martin. Just very quickly to follow up with what you said. And I won't get into specifics, but just thinking in my life sometimes how suffering can bring us closer to God. Sometimes I have impatiently prayed that, Holy Father, I can't do this. This is too hard. This is too much. And the answer has often been, well, you can't do it, and you need to know that. So, that's all I was going to say.
Great thoughts. My thanks to all of you for listening tonight, for watching this presentation. Actually, it's not tonight for you. You may be watching in the morning or any other time. Thank you for joining us. My thanks especially to our participants, Cassandra, Hedelius, Professor John Gee, Richard William. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be with you for another roundtable. Check out the Interpreter website. There's some great stuff there.